Hello everyone. Today we're going to pick up where we left off last week, which is looking at the environment from the perspective of markets, thinking about what is best for the human environment interaction, thinking about valuing the environment instrumentally rather than intrinsically, and calculating that value by estimating how it contributes to consumer surplus and producer surplus. Specifically, we're going to think about how that consumer surplus and producer surplus are reduced when we have deviations from perfect competition, when we have market failures. And we're going to look at a couple of different market failures over the coming weeks, but today we're going to spend most of our time thinking about the market failure of externalities. And this really is the chief theoretical structure for how economists mostly think of environmental problems. And so the public goods issue, monopolies, monopsonies, those are common market failures as well, but this externality one is really going to be omnipresent. And we're going to illustrate how we can calculate the magnitude of the reductions in consumer surplus and producer surplus by referring to that deadweight loss concept, which we introduced last week. So just to reiterate, markets will promise efficiency when we let individual economic agents pursue their own self-interest, and that will give us the socially optimal outcome, but only as long as those markets are perfectly competitive. And markets can fail to be competitive in a variety of ways. Externalities being probably the most common, that's the one we're going to consider today, but also by failing to recognize public goods, by failing to control for market power, which may happen with monopolies or monopsonies, when there are information problems, which basically just turn into monopolies or monopsonies, and when there are significant transaction costs. And so we're going to look at the transaction cost problem next week. But today, we're going to focus more on the externality side of things. So what is an externality? Externalities exist whenever the welfare of some agent depends not only on his or her activities, but also on the activities under the control of some other agent. And so in economics, we think of agents as being any body, any party which has decision-making authority. And so this can be an individual, it can be a household, it can be a company or a country or a town, really any participant in markets which can make a choice. And so externalities are not inherently bad, as this illustration would suggest, right? So the welfare of this individual in the middle depends not only on their own decisions, but also on my dog Boone screaming above them in the apartment immediately above them, somebody playing the saxophone, somebody playing the trumpet, somebody singing. Their welfare is impacted by those around them, even though they're not engaged in the same decision-making process. However, externalities can be positive as well, and those still present problems for markets when we fail to account for them. So at its core, this is a relatively simple problem to illustrate using the supply and demand framework. We could illustrate it with as few as one extra line on our supply and demand graph. If you want to be really thorough, you could draw 2 lines as well. So I'll show you over the coming slides how we would do that. But basically, we just want to think of there being an extra market which is unaccounted for in the original market of that supply and demand graph. So for example, we can think of a steel industry producing steel, but also adding pollution to the local environment per unit of steel they produce. And so the social costs of pollution are not factored into the supply curve for the firm. They're not impacting their marginal private costs, but they do impact the rest of society by impacting the marginal social costs. And so when we have that divergence between marginal private cost and marginal social cost, or marginal private benefit and marginal social benefit, then we're going to have a missing market and an externality which is going to be imposed on the rest of society due to no role of their own, no decision-making authority of their own. So we're going to think of three primary types of externalities. You don't have to know these technical names, the first names, just focus on what's in the red. But when we have a negative externality, that's going to be like the example on the previous slide, or the image with the people playing the saxophone in their room. This is when an activity imposes a cost on a third party. And on the other hand, we have the positive externalities where an activity imposes a benefit on a third party. And I think this is a little bit less intuitive, but especially given the pandemic, we can certainly think of an example of what a positive externality would be, and you may have even heard this be discussed in the news. We also want to consider these pecuniary externalities or spillovers that can either be positive or negative, but they're going to be specifically with regard to price, and that's obviously due to the word pecuniary here. And so these are going to spill over from one market transaction to another directly through the price and not through some external or missing market. So the best example of a positive externality is a vaccine. So if you go out and get your COVID vaccine, it means you probably won't infect me later on, right? If you get the Moderna or the Pfizer one, 95% chance you have immunity. We don't, I guess, technically know whether you can still spread it or not. But for example, with flu vaccines, you're not a carrier, you don't spread it. I receive some benefit by your decisions, even though I have no role in making that decision. There's a difference between the marginal private benefit, which you get to receive by getting the vaccine, and the marginal social benefit, which I receive by your decision, even though I don't play any role in that. On the other hand, we can also think about negative externalities through medication, and one of those would be mismanaging antibiotics, and that being more likely to lead to superbugs. So if you don't use antibiotics that often, but other people use them for everything. Anytime they get a minor cough or a headache or something like that, they'll open a Z-Pack if they have access to it, or if they're prescribed a set of antibiotics, they don't take it until they're fully cured. If they just take it until they feel better, then they're allowing those that bacteria to become stronger and become resistant to antibiotics. And by doing so, are increasing the likelihood that that could impact me later on down the road, even though I have no role in their decision about how they're going to manage their antibiotic usage. And so in that case, that's a clear negative externality as well. And we can illustrate both of these using a supply and demand framework. So when we apply this concept to the environment, one of the clearest examples of a negative externality is that of acid rain. And so acid rain is a byproduct from using coal or other dirty forms of energy production. And you can see in this little illustration here that it's produced by decisions made by the energy producer, becomes part of the atmosphere, comes over, rains on this town, rusts out their car, ruins fisheries, and damages local ecosystems, even though those ecosystems, those fisheries, those car owners have perhaps no decision in the production of that energy from the fossil fuel. And so if we are thinking about controlling or limiting the externality from the position of a policymaker, there's going to be a variety of tools which we can use. And so we kind of talked about this last video as well, that when when these externalities, when these market failures occur within the jurisdiction of a single governmental authority, or at least under a government which has the ability to have centralized action, then we're going to have a broad range of policy tools which we can use either through market mechanisms, through supply and demand and price and quantity instruments, or through just outright regulation to limit the damage from these market failures. If they're happening interjurisdictionally, if this is happening across country lines, for example, then our hands are going to be more tied, and we have to start thinking about kind of that game theoretic way of thinking about market failures. But we're going to really take this class more from that perspective of the centralized government approach. So the best example of a pecuniary externality is with regard to housing. And you want to think of a pecuniary externality as not having a missing market, such as we saw with acid rain as a byproduct of fossil fuel power generation, or antibiotic resistance coming from mismanaged antibiotic use, or herd immunity coming from vaccine use. The pecuniary externality is going to spill over directly through the price channel of the market in which all participants are involved. And so when we think about Gull Lake, or homes on Gull Lake, so this is an image from Zillow. For anybody who hasn't been on Zillow yet, I guess at this point in your life, which makes a lot of sense, mid-20s, 30s are going to hit, it gets addicting. It's pretty, I mean, I don't know, watch some HGTV, get on Zillow, call it a night. But the homes, so Gull Lake's in a position where it's kind of between, it's to the northeast of Kalamazoo, so it's between Battle Creek and Kalamazoo. It would be what would presumably be a good place to live for someone who has a spouse working in Battle Creek and they work in Kalamazoo. And so it could be a good place for a primary residence. However, pretty much all along the lake are full of secondary homes, rental properties, vacation homes, and that drives up demand, which increases the price. And so you get homes like this one right here for $1.3 million, even though it's, if you put it out in the middle of Berrien County, would be worth, I don't know, $300,000 or less. And they have then those people buying those vacation homes, second homes, have a direct impact on the social welfare of other people in that market who are looking for primary homes. And so that's what we want to think of with pecuniary externalities. So now that we have some examples in mind, let's go back to that consideration of externalities from a market perspective and think about why externalities present a problem. So an externality will imply that either the social cost does not equal the individual cost, the social benefit does not equal the individual benefit, or both. And this leads to a situation where the incentives for the individual are not what society wants them to do. And we have a creation of an inefficiency in the market. And by, once again here, individuals pursuing their own self-interest, we're not going to get that optimal outcome that free market economics would suggest. So what does this lead to in the end then? It could either lead to a situation where there's too much of socially costly goods, such as pollution, being produced relative to what the economy, what the society would want. Remember from last video, we don't necessarily think of a world with zero pollution as being optimal from an economic perspective or from a valuation of nature instrumentally perspective, because that means that we are not spending our resources efficiently or wisely, because we could be putting them towards higher value usages, such as investing in healthcare, education, whatever else is important to you that requires money. An externality may also lead to too little of a socially beneficial good being produced. such as the flu vaccine, such as education, if we are not accounting for that positive externality from a centralized government perspective or internally within the market through private incentives. And so we also want to think of this not only from a price perspective, but remember that in a supply and demand graph, we have both prices and quantities. And so, not only are there too much and too little of bad goods and good goods, respectively, but the prices for the bad goods are too low. We're able to pollute too cheaply. And the incentives through the price channel don't exist for the firms which are imposing the externalities, for the agents who are imposing the externalities, to innovate, to recycle, or any other method which may make their production cheaper to society, which would otherwise be possible if those costs were internal. So we're going to head back to the supply and demand graphs for a couple of slides here, and we can think about an example of how we can view inefficiencies in the supply and demand framework. And so let's think of a natural gas industry producing energy, but also necessarily by the production of energy creating pollution as well. And we can visualize what the market for natural gas would look like by intersecting the upward sloping supply curve, which represents the marginal cost to the firm, the private marginal cost, with a downward sloping demand curve, which represents the private marginal benefits to participants in that market, to consumers of energy. And what we're missing here is the cost to the rest of society of that pollution. And so that's not included in the social cost to the producers. And so our conceptualization of consumer and producer surplus being that triangle C, B, and A is not going to actually represent the true consumer and producer surplus because we're going to have an additional cost in that market. And so that cost is always going to come in to the left and above of the marginal private cost curve. And we can think about this by reading the graph and saying, for example, at the second unit produced, the marginal cost to the individual firm is maybe $10. However, if we go back to that second unit, what's the marginal cost to society, what's the marginal cost to the private firm plus the marginal cost to society? It would maybe be $15. And that would be the case for every unit of, for example, natural gas that's produced. The total costs are going to be greater than the costs only to the firm. And so when we have this missing market, when we are not accounting for the cost of society, then we're going to overproduce that good, natural gas, at too low of a price. And so in an unregulated market, we would be producing point E here, but the optimal amount of production of natural gas for society would be 0.0. And so we know that because the demand curve is capturing the marginal benefit and the marginal social costs are represented by this MSC curve. And so for E units of natural gas produced, so we're producing, QM units, for every unit produced past point Q star, beyond that quantity, the costs are going to be greater than the benefits. So costs greater benefits for this whole triangle. And that's obviously going to be inefficient. It would be better to stop production at point O where the marginal costs are exactly equal to the marginal benefit, and we fully exploited all gains from trade. We've got as much value out of the market as we can without overproducing. And so that's really the central problem of a negative externality. It's going to look similar, just reversed for a market failing to account for a positive externality. And again, because those costs are external, means that there's no incentive to reduce the pollution or innovate in any way. And so for every unit I produce, society loses, and we need to come up with some way either to reduce the quantity from QM to Q star or increase the price from PM to P star, or both. Okay, so let's take a look at now how we can illustrate consumer surplus and producer surplus more exhaustively on a supply and demand graph when there's a negative externality. And so we have a variety of curves here, which I guess it would help to better explain what they are. So we have an initial price, P star, which is defined by the intersection of the demand curve, which remember is the marginal benefit curve, and the supply curve, which is going to be that marginal private cost. So supply decisions are made by firms with respect to the marginal cost it takes for them to produce an extra unit of the good or service. So what are the other two curves? Well, the marginal cost E, that's just our marginal externality cost, and we're assuming there that each unit we produce actually has a worse externality for the more that we produce. That maybe that first good that we produce isn't really that damaging, but not only does the cumulative damage add up, but each additional unit that we produce exerts a worse externality than the unit before it. So that's an upward sloping externality curve. We may also have, like I said, a flat or constant externality. And when we add the supply curve to the externality, to MCE, then we have that marginal social cost curve. So you're going to want to bear with me here because this is going to have a lot of triangles, a lot of letters. You're going to feel like you're on Sesame Street all over again. So let's first consider what consumer surplus and producer surplus would look like when we have a completely free market, when it's uninterrupted, no government intervention, no taxes, no nothing. We just have a market price P star, which is the product of supply and demand intersecting. So the consumer surplus is going to be that area underneath the demand curve and above the equilibrium price. So this graph is going to look like a unicorn vomited on it. As soon as I'm done drawing, there's going to be a lot of bright colors here. But this is going to constitute or be constituted of triangles or areas A, B, C, and D. Remember, consumer surplus is the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they actually do pay. So that's all positive. Those are all good things. Producer surplus is going to be a little bit different. That traditionally, producer surplus for the individual firm, for the private sector, or not private sector, but for the producing firms in that market, is going to be the area between the price which they receive per unit of production and the cost which it takes them to produce those goods. However, we aren't looking at the producer surplus for a firm, we're looking at the producer surplus for society. And so we're going to look at the difference between price, P star, and the marginal cost curve for the marginal social cost curve. So with that in mind, let's actually start illustrating that with purple. Why not? So we know that unambiguously the area above the relevant cost curve and below the market price is going to be part of producer surplus. So why isn't G part of producer surplus? Well, because that's only above that marginal private cost curve and not above the marginal social cost curve. And since it's not above the marginal cost curve that we're concerned about, then it's not part of producer surplus. So remember, above the relevant cost curve, below the price. However, we're not stopping with triangle H because we're producing, call this Q, call it QP star. We're producing QP star units of production. And so every unit that we produce is going to incur they're going to contribute something to either consumer surplus or producer surplus. There's going to be some relationship between marginal benefit and marginal cost for every unit which we produce. So when we go beyond that triangle F, we want to think about the difference between the marginal social cost curve and the price. And so we can see that triangle C is between the price and the marginal social cost curve. Triangle D is between the price and the marginal social cost curve, and triangle E. So basically this whole big purple triangle here is between the marginal social cost curve and the price. However, the price is below the marginal social cost. So that's all being subtracted from our producer surplus. That's all a negative. So let's now see what consumer surplus and producer surplus would look like for in a socially optimal market. When we have government intervention, we have maybe a tax which is regulating the producers from polluting, or we have some way of enforcing that the marginal private cost curve is going to look like the marginal social cost curve. And so when we do this, we are going to have some reduction in the consumer surplus, right? So now we're producing S star price. I'll put P equals S star, and this is going to be Q S star units of production. And we're looking at the area above the price and under the demand curve, the difference between what they pay and what they're willing to pay. So we're stopping it at QS star because that's going to be how many units are produced. That's where the demand curve intersects the relevant cost curve. So we're reducing our consumer surplus, so it's not immediately looking like our total welfare is going to be improved. However, our producer surplus is going to be the area between the relevant marginal cost curve, our marginal social cost curve, and the price for Q star, QS star units produced. And so it's going to be areas B and F. And importantly there, both of those areas are entering positively. So now we can start adding all of these up. So A, we're going to add CS plus PS. A only appears once, so A is part of it. B only appears once, so B is a part of it. F appears positively, so F is a part of the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus. However, C appears positively in consumer surplus and negatively in producer surplus. So does D. And E just appears as a negative, so we have to subtract out E. So our total welfare from the private market is going to be A plus B plus F minus E. And if we do the same thing for our socially optimal market, we have A appearing positively, B appearing positively, F appearing positively. And so that's going to be our total welfare in the socially optimal market, where we're regulating, we're controlling for that externality. And if we take the difference between those two, then we can see that the one on the bottom, the one for the socially optimal solution, is going to be greater by the amount E. That deadweight loss is appearing as a subtraction from the social welfare in the completely private market. So positive externalities are a little bit different. And really here we just are going to focus on the demand curve rather than the supply curve. And so when we think about positive externalities, we're going to think of a difference between the marginal private benefit being what the demand curve would be when we're not accounting for the externality. When we're accounting for the positive externality, we're going to have a marginal social benefit as representing a separate demand curve, which is up and to the right from the original demand curve. And so we're going to go through a similar exercise with positive externalities and show how we can illustrate the loss in efficiency by failing to account for positive externalities in the market, by essentially letting a free market play out such that positive externalities are not captured in the price. So let's take that same approach to analyzing consumer and producer surplus in a market with positive externalities as we did in the market with negative externalities. So in this case, we're going to be thinking about market for college education or universities. And we're going to have three curves. We're going to have our, we're going to assume that the externality of education is constant, that it's linear and flat, that we have a marginal private benefit, that is the original demand curve. We have a marginal social benefit that's going to be illustrated by the second demand curve, and that we have a supply of education, which is capturing the marginal private cost to the colleges and universities for educating students. So let's start off where we did last time, which is by thinking about what is the consumer surplus at price P star. So who are the consumers in this market? They're going to be the students, or the parents of the students, or whoever is paying for the education in this market. And so we're going to look at the difference between the price that they are able to pay, being P star, and the price that they are willing to pay, being captured by the demand curve and the private benefit. And so we can see that the area captured between those two lines is going to be C plus B. We can then think about the university as representing the producer surplus. And so once again, thinking about the difference between a little darker green here, the difference between the per unit cost it takes for them to educate each student and the price which they're able to receive from each student for the number of students which they educate, we then get an idea of what the producer surplus would be, which would be area A. However, if we are if we're educating, let's call this QP students, then for each of those number of QP students, whether that's 1,000 or 1,000,000, whatever it may be, there's going to be an additional benefit which accrues to society for the education of each of those students. And so we can also think about what the consumer surplus would be for society in addition to just for the students. And so here we're looking at the difference between the marginal private benefit and the marginal social benefit for each of those QP units produced. And so then we have area G and area D, which are capturing the value of the positive externality, the social benefit, the benefit to society. So why is that necessarily a bad thing then if what we're adding here is greater than, if there's no negative terms, if what we're adding is greater than the consumer and producer surplus, which would be not taking into account the society's benefit. And that's because we're leaving potential gains from trade on the table. We're walking away from money that we could, walking away from value that we could have if we would just increase the number of students going to college. And so now if we take a look at a different price, let's call that P equals S star, then we can look at the area underneath the demand curve and above the price, and we get triangle C. And so this is actually smaller than what it was for the consumers, for the students on the private market, where there is no account for the positive externality of education. So, and that's just because the price is higher. So what about for the university? Well, we're going to take a look at the area under the market price and above that marginal private cost curve for the university. So instead of just being area A, we're now looking at for QS students, area A plus B plus D plus E. So we're looking at a much larger triangle here. And then lastly, considering the benefit to society, we're getting areas under the demand curve for society for the social benefit, above that price, so that's areas G and F. So when we take the sum of the student consumer surplus, society consumer surplus, and the university's producer surplus. There's no negatives there, so we just add all 5 letters. We get C plus B plus A plus G plus D. When we do the same thing for the socially optimal price and quantity of college education, once again, we don't see any negative terms here, which means that we just add up all the individual letters, and we have the same letters which we have in the private market, but now we also have triangle F and E. And so that's going to be a recapturing of what would be deadweight loss if we would underproduce college education according to just the supply and demand on a private market, not taking into account the benefits to the rest of society of having a better educated citizenry, or whether that refers to how they act in society or what knowledge they're able to contribute to society, to the economy for the benefit of others through research and development, or just having a more efficient economy. All right, so let's just think of a couple more examples of negative externalities as it relates to the environment, and specifically as it may be experienced in parts of the developing world. And so agricultural technologies create some clear examples of externalities, often as negative externalities, which disproportionately affect the economically disadvantaged, who depend more on natural resources for their social welfare and may live in more frail ecosystems. And so one of the examples of the negative externality from agricultural technologies may be those which allow agricultural producers to over-extract water from aquifers or surface water sources, which would be at a greater rate than which those resources could naturally replenish. And so when they do that, that is in line with their own, maybe their private costs, but not taking into account the social costs, which that would, the impact that would have on the surrounding communities. And we can think of some possible solutions as a way to help the agricultural producers internalize those costs. And one may be to incentivize them to invest in a technology which may be costly but would allow them to not over-extract resources. And in this case, we'd want to think about subsidizing the behavior of private firms rather than taxing, because taxing, as we're going to see later in this video, and as you may remember from Econ 101, may end up coming back to hurt the very people who we are trying to protect. And so even though taxation fits into the government portfolio of policies which they can use to mitigate and combat externalities, if the producers are then transferring on the cost of that tax onto the people who buy their products, such as people who may be consuming food, then we're just hurting the very people which we wanted to help. So there's also the option that we can rely on philanthropy or altruism to help these people as well, but that's harder to think about from a supply and demand type framework. So if we think of another example, perhaps of shrimp farming in Thailand, we can look at some real data, look at a real study which attempted to calculate costs and benefits, and I think in part using non-market valuation techniques. And so in this example, we are considering 1,100 hectares of mangrove swamps being cleared for commercial shrimp farms in Thailand. And so there's going to be a clear difference here between the private cost and the social costs, or the private benefits and the social benefits. And one of those would be that mangroves provide ecosystem services that have value for the community, even if they aren't explicitly owned as a means of production for a particular company. And so they can serve as nurseries for fish to help populate natural fish species, as well as providing flood risk natural capital, mitigation natural capital in the forms of barriers from storms or soil erosion. And so following the transfer of mangrove area into area for shrimp farming, the villagers in the surrounding area experienced declines in fish catch rates, and then suffered storm damage and water pollution as a result. And so that's where economists can come in maybe a little bit too late and help estimate some of the costs and benefits of this approach. And so when we think about predicting what could have happened, given the clear externality which would appear in this situation, when we leave that market to its own devices, it's not going to produce an efficient outcome. And so thinking about estimating costs and benefits, the paper that considered this particular case study found that the value lost from further destruction of the mangroves in the area would be greater than the value that the shrimp farms would take in place of those mangroves. And so the efficient choice then, the one that's going to maximize consumer and producer surplus when we think about that social benefit, that external benefit provided by the mangroves, would be to preserve the remaining mangroves. And so using a variety of economic techniques, including methods of non-market valuation, the authors found that the mangroves would provide, up to 35,000 US dollars per hectare worth of ecosystem services. And since this was 20 years ago, that would be significantly more now. And even though the shrimp farmers would turn a pretty good profit financially of close to 8,000 US dollars per hectare, when you take into account the negative externalities which they're imposing on the rest of really on other shrimp farmers and the people surrounding them from water pollution, the corrected economic return for shrimp farming drops to as low as $200 per hectare, which is still positive. But again here, when you take into account the damage to the mangroves, and if the goal is ever to replace the mangroves, then that quickly becomes negative, and the cost is prohibitive. Cost benefit analysis here would suggest to leave the mangroves intact, continue traditional farming for fish offshore, and not to convert them into shrimp farms. So we can kind of predict and explain what would happen using economic theory and using the concept of externalities, and then we can quantify that using non-market valuation techniques and make a decision which is informed by cost-benefit analysis. So hopefully that's kind of tying together some of the key concepts of the class so far. So if we think of an example of a hypothetical problem with a clear negative externality, we can go over what some of the potential private solutions would be to solving that problem, and then consider what some of the governmental solutions would be as well. And so let's just think of some sample problem of a coffee shop dumping trash into the street, back into the alley, and think about how that impacts others, even though they don't have a role in that decision, and how we could get that coffee shop without government coercion to not dump their trash in the street. And so one of them, the overall goal here is wanting to get the coffee shop to internalize an externality and somehow get the social cost to equal the private cost. And so if they have in like a shared lease agreement of parking space, or they have like communal decision making where the coffee shop exists, then we can try to have the fellow boutique stores, whatever's around there, make the coffee shop hire a cleaning company so that they then have at least the cost of that pollution and trash internalized. We could assign property rights, and this is going to be what we're going to focus on next week, thinking about how we can have an efficient solution which is derived from negotiation between parties that either pollute each other or impose some sort of external cost on another party. And so in this example, we could allow neighbors to sue the store for violating their rights to a clean street. And the key takeaway from the Coase theorem is that as long as those property rights are clearly defined, it doesn't matter who we assign them to. We're going to have an efficient solution that is going to come from negotiation between parties as long as there are no transaction costs. And that's going to be the key assumption. We'll talk about that more next week. But in this case, we would have the same amount of garbage in the street, same amount of pollution, whether we say that the coffee shop has the right to pollute and the neighbors can pay them to not pollute, or whether we say that the neighbors have a right to a clean street and they can sue the coffee shop for polluting the street. And so as a part of that, we can also rely on common law justifications where we allow injuries to be compensated without property rights being invoked. And so these are all methods for helping the coffee shop internalize some of those external costs, but they're going to be maybe less direct, maybe less certain that it's going to be done, and rely on some assumptions such as clearly defined property rights or regarding the legal system. We could also think of what some governmental solutions would be, and the clear one here is going to be taxing the polluters to raise their private costs to equal the social costs. And so then the tax if you're taxing pollution, you then raise the private cost so that it equals the social costs, and the incentives align for the coffee shop not to pollute. Similarly, we could subsidize abatement technology so the social costs of production are lowered. In this case, we could have the government or the township, whatever it is, maybe fund give discounted rates for trash compactors, or something along, or maybe provide garbage pickup twice a week instead of once a week, or something along those lines, so that we're still operating through a market mechanism. We're lowering the costs, but we're not necessarily penalizing the coffee shop, which would then pass on that price to their customers if they're able. And so the other solution here between having a direct tax or subsidy would be creating a market for trading pollution, market for abatement. And we're going to be able to get, I'm giving you a kind of a sneak peek of what we're going to find in a couple weeks, but we're going to be able to get the same solution whether we create that tradable permits market or we just straight up tax or subsidize to get the efficient level. We can use supply and demand to understand what that efficient point of abatement and efficient price would be. So the Pigouvian solution is just going to be adding a tax to the marginal private cost so that it equals the marginal social cost. It's nothing really too complex. It's just setting the tax so it's exactly equal to the externality. And you'll want to keep this in mind for some of the homework and definitely for the exam coming up, as that is how we can use taxes to arrive at an efficient outcome. However, the problem with using taxes to correct for externalities, as alluded to earlier, is that taxes are not paid by those upon which they are levied, meaning that the real payer of a tax isn't who the government says it is, it's who has the least elastic demand or supply curve. And so on the following slides, I'm going to illustrate this using an example of a tax on producers selling sugary sodas or a tax on producers selling cigarettes. And so we're going to consider how elasticity matters in both those cases and how that impacts who actually pays for the tax. Similarly, when we think about corrective taxes or Pigouvian taxes, we're going to have a trade-off between revenue generation and behavior modification. And so if we want to use a tax to modify behavior as a way to discourage people from polluting, then it's not going to be a great tax. It's not going to be completely inefficient, but it's not going to be the best way to generate revenue, because part of the goal of that behavior modifying tax is to reduce the amount of the taxable activity. And so this is just something for you all to be aware of when you read about taxes on, for example, maybe speculative trades on Wall Street. That one way that we could discourage excessively risky behavior in stock markets is by creating a transaction tax on trades. And if what we're trying to do is raise revenue, that's one thing, but if what we're trying to do is discourage that behavior, then that's going to run counter to generating the revenue from that particular stream. We want to place a revenue generating tax on something that is going to be less responsive, maybe less elastic in terms of the quantity that's going to be exchanged. And so the only other criticism of Pigouvian taxes, which I want you to be aware of now, is probably the most intuitive. And this is going to be the one that you're going to hear from more Austrian economists. And so when I say Austrian economists, that doesn't mean Arnold Schwarzenegger's tax accountant, right? It doesn't mean people actually from Austria. Austrian economics is a school of outside the mainstream economics, which is much more free market. And so a free market economist is going to say, look, we shouldn't place a tax to try to correct an externality, even if the externality exists, because that's going to require knowing the optimal level of pollution or production of a dirty good or service. And that's really hard. That's really challenging to know. It's one thing to look at a graph and say, okay, at a line, that intersection of the marginal social cost curve and the marginal social benefit curve, that's where we need to be. It's another thing to look out in the real world, collect data, and say, should this tax be $10 a ton of carbon, or $11.50, or $8, or $40, or $80? And just having that giant range, when you multiply that by the total number of the total quantity of that good, it can really lead us maybe even further away from equilibrium than we were by not taxing it. And that's exactly what people that are more hands-off of the government would say. So the whether or not you think that's a legitimate critique or not depends on your faith in the ability of scholars, of economists, of academics to be able to actually estimate some of these marginal social cost curves or marginal social benefit curves, and also your adherence more or less to this quote by William Baumol, who's a famous economist, which says, if we permit ourselves to be paralyzed by counsels of perfection, we may have still greater cause for regret. And this is one of my favorite quotes about inaction, that inaction has costs as well, and that if we just do nothing, that doesn't mean that we're not incurring any waste or any costs. It just means that we're permitting the costs, the inefficiencies in unadulterated free markets to exist because we're afraid to use our knowledge to find out what the true answer really is. So these are some of the general critiques of Pigouvian taxation, but what I'm going to do on the next slide is illustrate this first point here, that taxes are not paid by those upon which they are levied, that elasticity matters. And after I illustrate that point, I will probably wrap up today's lecture on externalities and pick up next week with the Coase theorem and show how we can use private solutions as a way to manage externalities under certain assumptions. Okay, so let's say that we have two markets, one for sugary drinks and one for cigarettes. And yes, I had to pause that because I forgot how to spell cigarettes. Okay. Market for sugary drinks, market for cigarettes. We're going to have a supply and demand graph in each market. And in both markets, we're going to have, maybe let's assume the same type of supply curve. So the marginal cost for the production of sugary drinks is going to look very similar to the marginal cost of production for cigarettes. What's going to look different is going to be the demand curve. And so if we remember kind of our Econ 101 type material, we're going to think of the market for sugary drinks as maybe being maybe a little more elastic, and the market for cigarettes as being less elastic, more steep, that because of that people are more likely to become addicted to cigarettes, they're going to be less responsive to changes in prices. And let's think about now how taxes impact both supply and demand. So we're going to place a tax on the sale of sugary drinks and cigarettes to nominally be paid by the producer, by the end point of the sale. And so anytime we tax supply, we're going to shift the supply curve up and to the left. So we're going to draw this parallel to that original supply curve. We're going to do the same thing in the market for cigarettes. And now we're going to analyze how this impacts supply and demand, consumer surplus, and producer surplus. So we're going to find what the initial price would be in each market. Call this P0. Call this P0. And we'll find what price the consumers have to pay in each market and what price the producers receive in each market. So when we think about the price the consumers pay, they pay the price of the good plus the tax revenue there, or the value of the tax, and the producers aren't going to receive that PT because they have to pay the tax. And so they're going to pay the price which represents their marginal, they're going to receive the price which represents their marginal cost for that quantity. So that's what the difference in price would look like for the consumers and producers in the market for sugary drinks. When we look at the market for cigarettes, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to find the intersection of the supply curve with the tax and the demand curve, the P with the tax, and we're going to find the intersection with that quantity. So once again, QT, and the marginal cost curve. And my dog apparently really wants to go outside, and he's going to nose me until I let him out. So I may need to pause this and come back. Is that right? Are you going to do that? So just taking a quick look here at where, how the price changes. So when the demand curve is less, when it's more elastic, when it's the quantity demanded is more responsive to changes in price, then the share of the tax that's paid for by consumers is going to be relatively small, and the share of the tax that's paid for by the producers is going to be larger. Now, when the demand curve is steeper, the share of the tax that's paid for by the consumers is going to be larger, and the share of the tax that's paid for by the producers is going to be smaller. And so really, who pays for the tax in reality isn't determined by who the government collects the tax from. It's going to be determined by the relative steepness of their curves. And so when we think about placing a Pigouvian tax as a way to correct for an externality, you do want to be mindful of who's going to end up paying that tax. Is it going to end up hurting some of the exact people that we're trying to benefit? And if so, is there an alternative solution to achieving the same equilibrium output and price without placing the burden of that tax on people, whether that be consumers or producers that we're trying to benefit? Okay, so now that we're done talking about taxation, the very last thing I want to mention for the day is that we do have other governmental solutions to correcting for externalities, including command and control approaches. And these are like hard government hand coming down, just straight up telling the producer how much they are allowed to produce. And that would be an example of a quota, a quantity control. And for some types of negative externalities, such as DDT making eagles' eggs shells weaker and leading to the almost extinction of bald eagles, we set that quota at 0. We had command and control all the way down to you're not allowed to produce anything. And so typically, for the reasons that we considered last week, by thinking of the marginal cost, marginal benefit, these may be inefficient, and we may have better ways of implementing a control for an externality. Another governmental solution may be that we have performance-based regulation, which is going to indicate maybe how much can be emitted. So not necessarily how much of the good can be produced, but how much, if we can measure the pollution itself, how much of the pollution can be emitted. Or input regulation, where the government comes in and tells you what type of equipment you need to use. And so this was could be a method perhaps for implementing scrubbers on smokestacks to reduce the amount of air pollution. It could be a way to require certain sorts of fishing technology if we think that a negative externality of crab fishing is death of crew members, and we say that they maybe can only go crab fishing certain days, or they have to use like higher rails or something like that. We have other ways of controlling for externalities outside strictly of taxation, markets, and private sector solutions The question just is, everything has a cost benefit, and what are going to be the costs and benefits? What's going to be the maximal efficiency of any of these types of approaches? So that is all I wanted to say about externalities today. Thank you for bearing with me through some pretty long graphs and illustrations. I think there's a lot of value in understanding the theoretical underpinnings of the concept of externalities, so that you can be aware of how you could model some of the negative costs of pollution, in addition to being able to calculate them. Remember, if we calculate something once, we aren't assured that it has external validity, whereas if we have a model to suggest that it could be applicable in other situations, then we can be more sure of our predictive power of what would happen in that given situation. So hopefully we'll start trying to make that connection between theory and empirics a little bit more clear as we continue to go on in this term. But otherwise, have a good weekend. Thanks for your patience with the posting of this video.